Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar series. For those of you that are not familiar with our series, all of our previous sessions are recorded and available on our website, which is statecollectionservice.com. Before we get started, a bit of a disclaimer here. The following information is not intended as legal advice and should not be used as legal advice. Legal advice must be tailored to the specific facts and circumstances. Every effort's been made to assure that the information contained in this presentation is up to date as of the date of the publication. It's not intended to be full and exhaustive explanation of the law in any area, nor should it replace your own legal advice. Well, thanks again for joining us. My name is Steve Beard. It's my honor to serve as the host of this series. You know, we've served this industry for 68 years, State Collection has, and this series is designed to provide insight into trends or issues that you face every day. We're now on our 5th year of our series. I'd encourage you to, again, visit our website. We've had some outstanding sessions. Well, as you know, your phones have been muted, but we'll have time for questions at the end of the session. I'll monitor the question area, so feel free to ask your questions at any time, and if appropriate, I'll ask our presenter today, whatever that may be. But again, there's information or time at the end. Well, increasing costs, decreasing reimbursements. Well, you live it every day. ICD-10, ACA, or whatever. Managing your reimbursement rates and ensuring that payments are timely are critical to the success of your organization. High denial rates can have detrimental impact on your revenue cycle. At best, denials force your office to rework claims, causing a delay in funding. In other cases, the claim is rejected and must be written off as an avoidable loss. The keys to improving revenue cycle is to understand the root cause of the insurance denial and attack those at their source. Well, that brings us to today's topic, the keys to improving revenue cycle operations, leveraging predictive analytics to attack denials. We're very fortunate to have with us today David Franklin. David is a co-founder of Conance. He's responsible for product management and new product development. He brings a wealth of experience in both the healthcare industry as well as analytics. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. Thanks for spending a little bit of time with us today to learn more about predictive analytics and the area of denial management. I start with this little cartoon here, right? You guys and your peers across this industry certainly have a challenging job, right? And it often, to me, right, reminds me of this picture where you're juggling and trying to keep, 100 plates spinning at once, or 100 balls in the air, whichever analogy you prefer, right? There's no shortage of things coming at you at any given point in time, and that's really complicated, right? There's no question. And denials often feels like one of those areas, right? Because the payers do one thing one day, they do another, and you're kind of continuing to chase the issues. And denials is just one area across this, but we have an interesting set of challenges and operating reality to deal with. So as we think about what we're doing, right, and the challenge ahead of us is we're spending lots of time chasing lots of pieces, right? We're working through lists of accounts, we're processing denials, we're working against underpayments, we're statusing claims, we're doing all this. And invariably, there's waste in our processes. We are, without a doubt, touching accounts which have no value. And some of the statistics that we've seen get to the fact that if you're doing manual claim statusing, and I'm just going to focus in on a few of the areas, that we're going to talk about today. But if you're doing manual claim statusing, so you're either calling payers or you're checking payer websites, it's not uncommon that we've seen 40% of those efforts are when the rep touches that claim, it's due to be paid. Okay, that was kind of a waste, right? Helpful to know, I guess, but we didn't need to exert the effort. Similarly, and this one's a little different, is when denials come back, so you get an 835. We know, and you guys probably feel this, that 20% of the time, those denials will cost you more to work than you're ever going to get paid on them. And that's a real paradigm shift, right? And so we have this 80-20 rule, and we have this wasted effort that you see here at the end of the curve. The idea is really how do we redeploy some of these efforts and energies to create new value to get after the things that really can drive performance forward. One of the things we did recently is we partnered with a firm called Porter Research. They went out and did a survey of 100 revenue cycle executives all over the country, different size facilities, different contexts. And we asked them a number of questions. But one of the things that was really interesting and where I start this conversation, we asked them what their top priority initiatives were. What you can see here is at the top of the list, 2 of the top 3 things on their list related to denials. So you can see almost 90% of respondents said preventing denials and underpayments was one of their top priorities. And over 70% said resolving denials and underpayments is one of their top priorities. Clearly, this is an area of focus for you all and your peers around the country. And so we started to dig into this a little bit more, and then we'll talk to you about what we see people doing. It's not surprising inside that context that it's a top initiative, that respondents are not particularly happy with the current state of play. So 68% of respondents told us for preventing denials and underpayments, right? They think their current performance is poor or fair. That argues for a reason why you'd want to address this topic. And then as we asked the question and we kept digging, we asked, well, how are you thinking about resolving that and tackling that problem? This is not an area where people are looking demonstrably for consultants, right? This was kind of less than 20%, give or take. But it is a place where folks are looking for technology to really drive it. So over 50% of respondents, when looking to think about preventing denials and underpayments, are looking for some software type solutions in here. There are, new teams that are at play. So there are a range of things that we're going to talk about here, right? But clearly, people and technology are on the minds of folks as ways to solve this. And it feels like from our conversations around the country that this is one of those topics that keeps coming up in our conversations. These survey results are actually, matching the conversations we're having, and people are looking for ways to deal with this problem. Now, in terms of the traditional process and where we're going to go, right, there are an awful lot of steps around the claims process. And I'm going to, for the purpose of this conversation, be a little simplistic, right? And basically think about the left side of this page as claim submission and the right side as, claim follow-up. We're going to focus on the claim follow-up piece largely for this conversation today. So once that bill has gone out the door, that 837 has been submitted, we're going to talk about what happens after that. How do we think about that process, and where are the opportunities for leverage for us across that value system. So let me start with some of the challenges of the current approach. And this connects and may shed some light on why you and your peers are looking to improve denials. I think there's reasonably widespread recognition as you look at those survey results, which says this is a challenge and people want to overcome it. And then we start to think about why that may be the case. So, we think about the existing operational practices that many people follow, all right, and what that leads to. So, operational inefficiency. As we talk to providers around the country, the way they're following up on accounts, it doesn't make a lot of sense anymore, right? We're doing age and balance prioritization. We're manually statusing claims. Or we just add more staff if we're lucky enough to get budget for that. But it's not looking at the waste, it's not looking at the patterns in the data, and it's not being more surgical and targeted to say, how do I focus on the accounts which have value? Payer process is complicated. We know that payers use denial codes differently and inconsistently across the board. We know that 277, 276 processes are incomplete. They may not be enabled by all payers, and they also don't give you the granular insight that might help you actually understand where a claim really is in process. And then, and the other piece about it is the patient accounting system, if that is the workflow engine that you're using, really wasn't built to be a workflow tool. And the follow-up process for claims is complicated, right? You need to work with multiple departments, there's back and forth, and all this stuff, and that's hard to manage, and that leads to lots of complexity, which goes to the third column here, that if you're not using a solid workflow tool and you're kind of following some old practices, you're not going to really have visibility and control over what's happening. And I can't tell you how many conversations I have with folks on one of the leading patient accounting systems out there that talk about the proliferation of work queues that they've got and how accounts are in multiple places or maybe not in one of them at all. Accounts seem to get lost as they're working through their follow-up process, and it becomes a real challenge. So when you put all those pieces together, it's not surprising, right, that AR days may be going up, or labor costs are strained, or we resort to outsourcing, right, and so our outsourcing budgets go up because we need variable cost support to help reduce our backlogs and work some of these accounts. And so the puzzle isn't a great one to put together. And that kind of reinforces why people are looking at this and saying we need to do something different. A few more pieces of data just to add a little more context before I pivot to how does technology start to play a role in this. This is some data on denied claims and ultimately the cash recovered from working those denials. What is telling about this picture and all the data on it is that less than 4% of claims deliver 87% of the cash. That's of denied claims that are then subsequently worked, right? So from that point of 835 on, right, it's a small fraction that are driving lots of the cash in this example. And we can argue the concentration, and in some portfolios maybe that's 80-20, right? 20% of the claims are delivering 80% of the cash, but it's reasonably concentrated. That speaks to the opportunity for analytics, right? So can we identify the pockets of opportunity where we should be first and foremost focusing resources so we can drive differential performance and get that money sooner? The other dynamic to this is effort, right? You have constrained budgets, you have limited staff, and you have a growing pile of claims to work. What tends to happen is the bigger, more complicated claims tend to get touched more and more and more and more because we don't want to walk away from the money. I totally get that. But when we have, high cost per touch, right, when we aggregate all the cost per touch and it costs us $50, let's say, to work a denial, and I'll show you an example later, if our expected collection is 11, we've got an underwater economic proposition. And so this sort of cost churn, if you will, or we're continuing to spend effort and energy against those claims which are least likely to actually result in additional money, compounds our problem. Again, the question I think is, can we leverage predictive analytics, data mining, to uncover patterns and trends in the data that would help us get sharper about which are the claims that'll pay, what are the specific set of actions I need to take to be able to, cut the tail off, right? Not spend so much energy that ultimately bears no return. So this is where we start to think about how do you leverage technology, which isn't surprising. We're a technology vendor and an analytic vendor, but I'll shed a bit of light on kind of how we think about some of these pieces, which is two dimensions. One is, I think we're going to talk about exception-based workflow. And the other is we're going to talk about the role of analytics. Exception-based workflow in two dimensions here pertinent to this topic is if we can convert manual claim status efforts to electronic ones and we can automate that process, right, then that starts to mean that we can get that information not using staff, and we can then start to make sure that the right claims or the right status results show up on the right person's desk at the right time, as opposed to simply at day 14 everybody gets a status and then we have to manually process through that. Similarly, the prioritization of denials and underpayments. Instead of just simply relying on the age and balance and reason code sorts, if we can leverage analytics to say, I understand which of these denials or underpayments will pay me relative to effort, and so I can start to think about how much am I likely to collect. Now I can change the prioritization when I get an 835 back and drive a different set of workflow. And we'll go into what that means. But ultimately what we're starting to be able to do here is take these analytics and these insights to change the work queues and the follow-up strategy for you and your staff. So now we've got the right accounts showing up at the right time so that we're able to collect faster, reduce our days, and minimize our cost to collect in this process. I'd now like to spend a few minutes sort of doing a deeper dive for you on claim statusing, specifically electronic claim statusing. So we can talk about that, what it is, and how it works. And then the second part of this, I will then go into a little more detail about denial, predictive analytics around denials, and the ability to overturn those and how to work those differently. So electronic claim statusing. Essentially, think about this as taking the work that your folks do to go out to payer portals where they manually go to the website, they see what the information is, and then they look at the results that are on the website, they make a determination about what should happen next, they make some notes in the patient accounting system, and they may change the work queue where that account's supposed to go next, right, to ask for help from a different department. Electronic claim statusing changes this pretty dramatically. We're no longer going to log into websites on a manual basis. You're going to have the information come back into your host systems, and you're going to be able to drive workflow off of those reason codes. And they're actually proprietary reason codes from the payers, so they're more specific, which gives you the ability to take action on them in a more nuanced way. And so this whole thing is basically, instead of manual effort, you've got technology going out and scraping these portals and pulling back that information. This compares to typical processes in a few different ways, and I'll go through sort of a timeline on one, and then I'll give you some detail in a few pages about some of the differences in the data quality that comes back from this process than you would get from the 277, 276 process. Current processes, and this varies provider to provider, but you're waiting a certain number of days for payments to come in, and then maybe it's day 14, maybe it's day 21. You're having your staff work a list of accounts that have been billed 14 or 21 days ago. In this example, it's 14. They go to the portal, or they call the payer to find out where that claim is in process. They get the response, and they're going to think about what happens next to that, whether they work it themselves, whether they need to provide or get someone else to provide medical records or check authorization, what have you. Lots of manual work. What can happen in electronic claim statusing, you can start this process much earlier, and you don't need the collectors to be engaged in the decision-making process. So you can start this process at day 3 if you wanted, right? And it electronically goes out, grabs the information, and then comes back and says, oh, based on the reason code for where this claim is in process, I understand based on provider-specific rules and determination where this should go next. So who needs to look at it? What happens? How do I continue to advance that claim? And you can rinse and repeat and continue the cycle if, say, 7 days later on day 10, the claim still hasn't gotten paid. A number of terrific advantages if you can start to both automate that and accelerate it. As you think about that, right, we're getting much more timely information. So if we have the information sooner and it didn't cost us anything to get it, we can resolve those claims faster. We can get more detailed information, right? Because now we're getting all the information from the payer website, and it's meaningful, and it's actionable, and it becomes part of our host system record. The ability to also standardize and structure that follow-up workflow is really important, right? So now I don't have to have a person in the middle of interpreting what a payer may mean. I have set rules that said this is where I go next with this claim. It can automatically route in my system if I set it up that way. And lo and behold, I can resolve my AR much faster. I can also reduce my initial denial rate if I'm out ahead of these, and I can certainly accelerate my days to payment. What you can see from the pie charts here is just how kind of the continued statusing efforts, the shape of that portfolio evolves over time, right? So on day 1, in this example, right, certainly there's an awful lot of things which are pending, but you also know that a number of them are going to pay. And if you know that information and it all came back electronically, you'd never go look at that unless the payment date is missed. You keep cycling through, you've worked some of that information on some of the denials, what have you. You're now at a different spot, day 10, but you still have some pieces of this puzzle that you know are denials you can be getting after that. But you also know, in this example, 86% have paid or are due to be paid. So again, I don't need to worry about those unless I've missed the payment date. And that's how that puzzle accelerates through and really kind of changes the nature and shape of some of those pre-835 processes that you might have. I've mentioned a few times that these web bots and kind of electronic claim statusing are different than what you get from 277, 276 transactions. I won't go through all the details on this page, but to hit a few highlights, right, there are some notable differences. What you get when you go to this type of screen scraping technology versus the EDI standards. You're getting proprietary information that the payer has on their website. Again, that makes it much more actionable. Excuse me. You're getting information on pending claims. You're getting line item details with the denial reasons. You can also start to see what the payer says about patient liability and other such items. So again, we're putting providers into a spot which says, without manual effort, I can have a much richer understanding of where that claim is and set myself up to take an automated set of actions that are meaningful and appropriate for that claim at that point in the process. And that's going to only help accelerate my resolution and make my staff a lot more effective. To give you a perspective of just how much more effective that can translate into, here are some statistics that you see from one provider, quite large provider, that used electronic claim statusing and how that changed a number of their metrics. You can see a substantial improvement in their productivity. You can see that They were able to grow the number of claims that they had against the number of FTEs, right? And so you ended up in a world here where 51% increase in net revenue per FTE, a 16% reduction in FTEs, and this was done through attrition as things happen. But they were able to work more business, which is, I think, what many of you are all seeing, within a constrained, and in that case, declining budget, and do it quite successfully. And so they gave their staff the tools to be successful, to eliminate wasted effort, and to redeploy those efforts and energies into spots that actually drove cash return. Shifting gears a little bit now to denial and underpayments. So we've dealt with the part of this process where we've submitted the bill, we've done with statusing, we've tried to get the payers the information they need to prevent the denials before they show up. But now we've got an 835, and we know we've got a denial or an underpayment. So I shared earlier some statistics about how concentrated the portfolio can be with respect to additional cash that you get from working a denial and underpayment portfolio. Here's another example of that from an amalgamation across a few clients. And what we've done here is we've built a predictive analytics that basically asks the question, for this given denied or underpaid claim, how likely am I to get a subsequent payment, and effectively how much am I likely to get on that. That allows us to prioritize and stratify that portfolio very differently than if you thought about it from simply age, balance, and reason. And what you see in this curve, and this curve was an actual portfolio that they had been working, that we, in a data study, were able to say, okay, so let's look at this based on the analytics. And what we found is those 60% of the claims, the first 60, again, sorted highest likelihood of subsequent payment down to lowest, the first 60% of that led to over 98% of the subsequent dollars collected. And this is a denial curve, and it's almost $4,300. That's good, right? I mean, that's where you want to spend your time and energy. What becomes really interesting is that last 40%, and certainly that most acute in that last 20% of that ranking, those are claims that represented less than 0.3% of the subsequent dollars collected, and the recovery was $11 a claim. So when I was talking earlier about that we spend lots of energy working the tail trying to get money out of denials and underpayments, and we keep spending effort to try and get those overturned, right? If that costs us $35 or $50, right, to work that claim over its life, and our expected amount that we're going to collect is 11, that was a bad trade. I understand why we do it, but when you start to think about predictive analytics, that does create the opportunity to think about this problem and this challenge differently. Now, a lot of people start to think about this, and this is definitely paradigm shifting for many, right, given how we've all thought about working a book of denials. So a few finer details on this and to look at it. This page looks at the denial segmentation against two different variables. One is by balance and the other is by reason code. We often get the question that says, well, right, this is simply a balance, segmentation in disguise, or I know for certain reason codes they always get overturned, or they never do, and so it's a set of heuristics based on extremes, right, and absolute certainty. As you look at this data, that's not actually the case. When you look on the left side of this page, this basically is looking at that denial segmentation for claims in certain balance ranges. And you can see there's a mix of high, medium, and low priority, and that's based on that follow-up segmentation across all the balance ranges. Now, certainly, right, there's a skew with certain balances, lower balances to high, but There are important claims to follow up on that are mid and high priority, so therefore worth money in the lowest of value segments. And there are also some mid priority in the highest dollar segments, right, which says these aren't the first ones to go after. So if we start to think about prioritization, maybe we should start thinking about high priority and the value of where claims are. And so work that high priority across regardless of balance first, then work medium, and then start to think about different options around the low. Starts to change the paradigm. When you look on the right side of this, this is the distribution by reason code. And the percentages, as you can see on the bottom, is the low or no priority, right? So these are the ones that fall at that tail end of the curve. These are certainly spots where you tend to think that there's not going to be much value. And that percentage does vary across reason codes, without a doubt. But there's some percent across all of these where we would say don't follow up on them. And the high priority, so where we should target first, also varies across segment, across reason code. What this again says is you start to think about it, and you start to think about how do I leverage analytics to combat this challenge that I have. It says analytics can pick out those opportunities in your portfolio in a way that you can't do with a simple set of rules, right? And so it's not as simple as, I know this pair, these balances, this reason code, I should always follow up on. That will still lead to leakage in your effort and lead to spending time and energy in spots that don't make sense. The same holds true, quite frankly, as we look at this across pairs. And so you can see here for one portfolio across pairs, the D1, 2, and 3, D1 is our code for low priority, 3 is the high priority, right? And so you can start to see here, again, similar concept that even across pairs, there's a differentiation on how we should be following up and how we should be thinking about those priorities. When that comes to thinking about workflow, now we kind of tie some of these pieces back together. We start to think about this from a couple different dimensions, right? But most certainly as you're hearing me talk about this, right, we're thinking about how do we think about that low priority tail end of the curve very differently, right? So can I remove that burden from some of my internal staff and think about that in a couple different ways? We have some clients that look at that and say, it's a wasted effort. I understand the economic trade. I'm willing to write those off because it's not worth anybody's effort. Okay, that's a choice, right? And I can argue it both ways. Other people say, I'm not willing to write it off, but this is a spot where I can start to think about also changing my small balance outsourcing paradigm, where many of us will use a vendor to deal with claims and denials under $2,500 at some point in the process. Well, maybe what we want to be doing here is taking low value and even mid-value claims, right, depending on our capacity, and start to think about those and say, well, actually, instead of just doing this on a balance basis, why don't I think about an analytic where I can use somebody external on a contingent basis to work those accounts, and they can break their pickaxe, and hopefully they're able to overturn it. But from a utilization of your scarce resources, right, which are fixed in your budgets, how do we get the maximum productivity out of those resources? And that's clearly going to be starting with the high priority claims, right? So the most likely to overturn for the most value. When you start to think about kind of all these pieces, right, you're able to reduce your work lists internally very substantially, and this is all configurable depending on how people want to draw the lines on what their capacity is and their priorities. So this isn't an absolute approach. But you can also then drive this to a world where you can collect most of that cash in a very different economic architecture. In this example here, right, 27% of the claims in that high priority are leading to 89+% of the payments. At mid priority, right, is 45% of the claims, almost 10% of the payments. we fundamentally transformed, in this example, how we think about working a book of denials and underpayments to accelerate the cash, because we're touching the right ones first, and we've changed the cost structure against that pretty dramatically. And so we're not left in a cycle where we're always chasing a backlog, where we're spending time on things that we just can't get resolved. But we now know the claims we should be focused on. We're working the right book of business, and we're prioritizing it in the right order and strategically thinking about which claims we should be working internally and which ones we should be using somebody else for. So, just to close a few thoughts here, and then I'll open it up for questions. There are a number of different ways we think about how you can start to leverage this. Hopefully, some of these ideas resonate for you and maybe things that you've already started to do inside your organizations. But thematically, there are a number of pieces here. One is we would encourage you to reallocate resources to the highest value activities, right? Don't continue to just work the list top to bottom, but think about ways that you can get sharper on the data and the insights to segment out your population, your portfolios of accounts, so you can be more surgical, you can be more targeted, you can reduce your cost to collect against those and accelerate your cash. Second, there are hidden opportunities across multiple processes here, right? I mean, we've talked about two in this case, from claim statusing to what happens when you get your 835s back. There are lots of processes that have opportunities to improve, and you can start to think about that in terms of where can data help me change my process? How do I think about the leverage of insights and analytics to unlock that 80-20 rule that I started with, right? Where do I find, how can I use data mining to figure out where I've got shortfalls in my process, where I've got wasted energies, and then I can start to improve. Technology can help drive that, whether that's predictive analytics, whether it's automated and electronic claim statusing, whether it's different workflow tools, what have you. But there is a growing role to think differently about the standard processes that we have and how we can couple data analytics with the right set of next actions to drive our results differently. All this combined starts to change what you're seeing in the trends, right? So it's not necessarily going to, day one change the volume of claims that you're dealing with, right? Your businesses are growing. And denials still continue to manifest themselves, and payers are certainly complicated. But if we start to take advantage of tools which allow us to see what the payer is seeing, what they're doing, data mine those patterns, it allows us to keep up and start to get ahead, so we're not constantly behind dealing with that. And that really starts to change what you're dealing with, because it means that the constrained cost structures you're working under, right, which makes it seem like we can never get ahead of this problem or never deal with our backlogs in a sufficient way. All of a sudden now we have a different way of thinking about that. We can get after those accounts, and all of a sudden we can actually start to be strategic and thoughtful and drive our results in a very different way. So as you put these pieces together, right, I would encourage you to also think about this across the full spectrum, right? So think about the end-to-end opportunity ahead of you, so you can really take advantage of the pieces. That starts to get into, right, surgically we talked about where you can insert claim statusing, where you can put denial analytics. The end-to-end opportunity starts to then say, how do I take some of the insights that have come out of those to then feed back into my processes? What would I change based on some of those observable data? What are the root causes? How do I change my editing process so my claims get cleaner going out the door? How do I feed some of the data and the patterns based on what I'm seeing that payers do and shift? How do I feed that back into my monthly payer review meetings? So now I can start to close the loop and start to influence the process upstream as well. With that, I'll say thank you for your time, and I'll open it up for a few questions.
Thank you, David. Okay, so just as a reminder, use the questions panel there on the GoToMeeting. Insert that in the question area, and I'll read those to David. We've actually had a couple. The first is, are you using the 835 to drive the denial reason, or are you using that from the web bots?
So the denial reason, it depends on which part of the process. So if we have an 835, and so now we're doing the denial prioritization, we're going to use the reason off the 835. What becomes interesting in this architecture when we are screen scraping the payer portals is we can do that before we have an 835, and we can get the specific reason why a payer is going to be denying a claim before you get the 835. And so you know it earlier, and you also know the specific reason as opposed to the generic reason code, which, as we all know, payers have a habit of using differently from one another, so it makes it hard to standardize those follow-up processes.
The next is, when do you see payers providing the same meaningful denial information via the 277 versus their website?
I'm not sure when they'll do that. I think the challenge is that with the 277 process, they're forced into a set of standards across the industry, which means that they're limited in terms of the codes. When you go to their websites, you could have, for one payer, a couple hundred, or others, have a couple thousand reasons for where a claim is in process, what information they need as follow-up, or why they're denying it. So I'm not sure we're going to get to a spot where the EDI standards are going to be able to accommodate that.
You mentioned the web bots. I assume that is different than screen scraping? Is that true?
Effectively, it's the same, right? So it's technology which will go and it'll scrape the payer portal, and the bots will pull the information back and structure it so it's usable as data in a process. But yeah, it's effectively screen scraping.
Can you comment on the process of implementation? What's involved from a technical perspective?
Sure. So there are a couple pieces here. What the inputs to us tend to be 837s and 835s, right? So the 837s in both cases, denials as well as the statusing is helpful. But with the 837 information, so it's already existing data set, we can use that and agree on what the statusing timeframes are, and we can then go out and get that data. The 837, 835 pair on the denial and underpayment front obviously tells us a claim has been denied, and then gives us that information which can allow us to start that prioritization process. In either case, what we would then send back is a response file to you with the results of the screen scraping, if that's what you wanted. But in both cases, the common factor is we're going to help you take the results of either the screen scraping or the result of that denial analytic, put a segmentation parameter on it on our end, or work with you inside your host system, depending, so that you can pull that forward into your workflow and then route that account automatically to the right person, the right department.
Okay, and then a follow-up to that question then is, well, you already mentioned the response file, but what level of integration do you have to Epic?
We have done this process with a number of Epic clients.
Okay.
So the 837, 835 isn't unique to Epic, but we can send back the detailed claim status information that we do get off a payer portal, so that can get ingested back into Epic. We can work with you on both sides to convert the next action step into a billing indicator response file, the billing indicator update file, and then you take that and create the system actions that pushes it to the right work queue. So we know how to do that and have done it multiple times.
Okay. We're waiting on other questions. I just might remind everyone that we've been recording this session, so if you'd like to listen to the session again, it's available on our website. The address is there. You may also, after the session is over, think, gosh darn it, I wish I would have asked this particular question. Let me show you our contact information. If you'd like a copy of the deck or would like any other questions, feel free to reach out to either one of us. This is a follow-up on the denial reasons. Do you find that they're more robust, much like the 276, 277 from the payer websites?
When you're pulling back the reasons from the websites, yes, they are more specific and actionable for you. And so while there's more granularity, that allows you to take more specific actions as you want to resolve that. We do find that people tend to use the information from the claim status to drive their actions prior to getting the 835. Once they get the 835, they tend to assume that becomes the record. So they may do a little bit of pairing of that information. Certainly they have the record of the claim status detail on the notes, but they tend to drive workflow of that specific reason code with the prioritization after that fact.
In your segmentation, the high, medium, and low, is the balance a factor in that as well, or not?
Balance is going to come into it at a certain level, right? Because to push something up the curve to expect a high amount to be collected, it has to have a high balance.
Okay.
At some level, but it's not the dominant factor. The way we think about those models is we looked at a history of claims denied and overturned, right, and put that into a data mining exercise and modeling environment where we can understand at a lot of depth what the patterns are for why certain claims which have been denied get overturned and which ones don't. And it gets pretty granular in terms of what were the reason codes and what were the procedure codes and all kinds of other information, and it has variables related to the payer and the provider and all kinds of other stuff that goes into that sausage making that allows that to go well beyond simply a balance sort. There are, easy to say, over 100 variables that go into that calculus, so it's not simply a balance driven with two other modifiers.
Another question on the implementation, and I think it just, I'm sure that this is based on what you just mentioned, but is this calibrated to the specific payer mix of a facility?
That's a good question. So yes, it is. So our model starts, we have kind of a pooled information set, so we are looking at patterns across payers and across providers, which helps build up a robust set so we can understand the variance in patterns across a larger set of data, which makes the insights and the differences more discernible. It also means that the specifics of how any one provider does their follow-up strategy doesn't skew the results. And so we're able to identify opportunities in our sample, right, where perhaps one provider has said, I'm not working anything that meets these criteria, but other providers are, and therefore we're able to actually discern where those opportunities lie, because someone's chosen not to work those accounts, but we can actually piece apart the 20% of that portfolio that becomes really valuable to work. When we go through this exercise, we take a history from our clients, we add it to that pool, and we go through to understand how that modifies for their behavior, their experience. But we also go through and work with them to understand their capacity and the cut points, so we know where to draw the lines between high, medium, and low relative to their cost to collect and the amount of staff that they have to actually work those different populations of accounts. Because ultimately, as we try and stratify the inventory, we need to make sure we're aligning that with the opportunity for a given provider in their context.
Great. Well, just waiting on any other questions that might come in. Let me just give it. Well, David, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom on analytics with us. It's been very, very helpful. Again, for those of you that would like any additional information, feel free to reach out to either one of us. And again, the recording will be available here momentarily.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a fantastic day. Bye.